The dust settled around her worn boots as she stood at the edge of Thomas Mackenzie's ranch, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert plains behind her, and she looked so small standing there with nothing but a cloth bundle in her arms and eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone so young. Thomas had been mending fence posts when he first spotted her, and at 62 years old, he had learned to read people the way he read the weather, and this girl carried a storm inside her, that much was clear, and her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders except for the strip of faded cloth tied across her forehead, and there was dried blood on her temple and dust caked into lines on her face. He set down his tools and walked toward her slowly, the way you might approach a wounded animal, and she didn't move, just watched him come with those deep brown eyes that seemed to look right through to his bones. When he got close enough to speak without raising his voice, he stopped and waited for her to break the silence first, and that was something his late wife Martha had taught him years ago, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is give someone permission to speak when they're ready. The girl's voice came out rough, like she hadn't used it in days, and the words she spoke made his chest tighten with an old familiar ache. "They said I bring death," she told him, and her chin lifted just slightly in defiance, even as her eyes glistened with unshed tears and everywhere. "I go bad things follow, and they told me to leave and never come back, and they said the next town would know my face and to keep moving." Thomas felt something crack open inside him because he knew that kind of loneliness, the kind that makes you believe you're poison to everyone around you. And he had felt it himself after Martha passed, when the silence in his house became so loud he could barely stand it. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion in her stance and the way she held herself, like she expected him to turn her away. And instead he said what he would have wanted someone to say to him in his darkest hours. "Well, I don't put much stock in what people say, and this ranch has seen plenty of death already, and one more pair of hands around here wouldn't hurt if you're willing to work." The surprise that crossed her face told him she hadn't expected kindness, and she blinked rapidly and nodded once, and he gestured toward the house, and she followed him at a careful distance, like she still wasn't sure this was real. Her name was Elena Reyes, and over the next few days Thomas learned her story in small pieces that she offered up like precious things. She wasn't sure she should share, and she had grown up in a mining town 3 days' ride south, and when the mine collapsed and took her father and 7 other men with it, the town had looked for someone to blame, and her mother had died of fever the winter before, and Elena had been the one who found her, and then the mine, and then a fire that took 3 houses, and somehow in their grief and fear, the people had decided that this girl carried a curse. Thomas listened without judgment while they sat on the porch in the evenings, and he would whittle small pieces of wood while she talked, and he noticed how she never quite relaxed, always holding herself ready to run. But slowly, as days turned into weeks, something began to shift in the rhythm of the ranch, and Elena proved herself a quick learner and capable in ways that surprised them both. And she could handle horses with a gentle firmness that reminded him of Martha. And she never complained about the hard work, even when her hands blistered and bled. One morning Thomas found her in the stable before dawn, sitting beside his old mare Constance, who had been sick for days, and the girl had her hand on the horse's neck and was speaking to her in soft Spanish, and there were tears running down Elena's face. "I can't let another one die because of me," she whispered, and didn't seem to realize Thomas was there, and please not this one too. He cleared his throat gently, and she jumped and wiped at her eyes, but he just came and sat down beside her in the hay and put his own weathered hand on Constance's flank. "This old girl is 28 years old," he said quietly, "and she's lived a good long life, and if she goes tonight or tomorrow or next week, that's just the way of things, and it's not because of you. And do you understand that, Elena?" She shook her head stubbornly. "And you don't know what I've seen, and you don't know what follows me." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Do you want to know what I think? And I think you're a young woman who has suffered more loss than anyone should, and I think the people who should have protected you failed you. And I think you've been carrying a weight that was never yours to carry. But I was there," she insisted. "And every time something terrible happened, I was there." Nodded slowly. "And I was there when my Martha took her last breath, and I was there when my parents passed, and I was there when my best friend John died, falling from his horse 20 years ago. And does that make me cursed, or does that just make me someone who has lived long enough to know that life brings loss?" Elena looked at him with something like hope flickering behind the pain in her eyes. The ranch had been quiet for too long before Elena arrived, and Thomas hadn't realized how much. He had retreated into himself until she brought sound and movement back into his days. And she sang sometimes while she worked old songs in Spanish that her mother had taught her, and the melody would drift across the yard and settle into his chest, like warmth. He taught her things too, how to read the sky for coming weather, and how to know which fence posts were rotting before they fell, and how to make his mother's cornbread recipe that he hadn't made since Martha died, and she absorbed it, all with a hunger that went beyond just learning skills. One afternoon, while they were checking the water troughs in the far pasture, Elena asked him about the woman in the photograph on his mantel, and Thomas felt the familiar ache, but it was softer, now worn smooth like a river stone. "That's Martha," he said, "and we were married 37 years, and she was the best thing that ever happened to me. And when she died, I thought maybe I would too. And not from sickness, but from the loneliness of it." Elena was quiet, and then she asked what changed. He smiled a little, and nothing changed exactly, and the loneliness is still there. "But I learned that you can carry sadness and still find reasons to get up in the morning, and Martha wouldn't have wanted me to give up, and neither would your parents." She nodded slowly. "And we used to have a garden," she said, "and my mother could grow anything. And after she died, I tried to keep it going, but everything withered, and that's when people started saying I was cursed." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her. "And did you water the garden?" She blinked. "And what? Did you water it?" He repeated gently. "And did you tend it the way she did?" Elena's face crumpled slightly. "And I didn't know how, and I tried, but I was so sad and I forgot sometimes, and then the mine and I just plants die when they're not tended," he said, "and not because of curses, but because they need care, and you were a child who had lost her mother, and nobody taught you and nobody helped you, and that's not your fault." Something in her expression broke open then, and she cried in a way she probably hadn't let herself cry since it all began, and Thomas stood there solid as a fence post and let her. And when she finally quieted, he handed her his handkerchief, and they continued their walk. The seasons shifted as they do, and autumn came to the desert with its cooler nights. And Thomas noticed how Elena had started to lose some of that hunted look, and she smiled more easily, now, and her hands had grown calloused and strong from the work. And sometimes he would catch her standing on the porch at sunset, just watching the sky with something like peace on her face. They developed routines, and she would make coffee in the mornings while he fed the chickens, and they would work through the day side by side, and in the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk about small things and big things and everything in between. One night, she asked him if he ever got angry at God for taking Martha. "Every day at first," he admitted, "and I raged at the sky and the earth and everything in between, but Martha was a woman of faith, and she made me promise not to let grief turn me bitter, and so I tried to remember that death is part of life, and the love we share doesn't die just because she did." Elena was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I think that's what I forgot, and I forgot that my mother and father loved me, and I let the fear and the blame cover up all the good memories." Thomas nodded. "And that's what grief does sometimes, and it's like a dust storm that blocks out the sun, but storms pass if you wait them out." Winter came gentle that year, and Thomas turned 63, and Elena made him a cake that was lopsided and slightly burned, but he ate every bite and declared it the best birthday he'd had in 5 years. And she laughed, and the sound of it filled his house with something it had been missing. They decorated for Christmas in small ways, and Elena wove pine branches into wreaths, and Thomas found Martha's old ornaments in the attic, and together they hung them on a small tree, and on Christmas Eve they sat by the fire, and Elena told him about her family's traditions, and he shared his, and they created something new between them. The town was 12 miles away, and Thomas went in for supplies once a month, and he always went alone, and Elena never asked to come, and she seemed content to stay at the ranch where she felt safe. But one day in late January he asked if she wanted to join him, and she looked terrified. "What if someone recognizes me?" she said. "And what if word got back to my old town? And what if something bad happens while we